The Supreme Court yesterday handed down a new series of split decisions for the administration. The court upheld a Mississippi law that allows mail-in ballots to be received up to 5 days after Election Day. The decision emphasized the Constitution gives election authority to state legislatures and Congress, not the president. This was a 5-4 opinion, with Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Amy Coney Barrett joining with the court's 3 liberal justices in the majority. The Supreme Court also cleared the way for President Trump to fire heads of most independent federal agencies at will. In a 6-3 decision, the justices ruled Trump can fire Rebecca Slaughter from the Federal Trade Commission, overturning a unanimous decision from the court in 1935 that protected the independence of government agencies. The ruling effectively makes FTC commissioners and those who staff independent federal agencies serve at the president's discretion and eliminates Congress's bipartisan requirement for the agency. But the court is making an exception. One exception for independence at the Federal Reserve, at least for now. In a separate 5-4 decision, the court ruled Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook can keep her job as she fights dubious mortgage fraud claims from Trump and his allies. Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Brett Kavanaugh joined the 3 liberal justices in the majority on this ruling. Joining us from outside the Supreme Court is MS Now legal affairs reporter Fallon Gallagher. Also with us, MS Now legal analyst Charles Coleman. Fallon, I'll start with you for more headlines on these decisions. What struck you?
Yeah, Mika, I cannot underscore the significance of the Slaughter decision that we got yesterday. The court upended 91 years of its own precedent, which is no small feat. And this is going to fundamentally reshape the way that presidents have power. Before this decision, there were statutory protections from Congress that prevented the president from firing these independent agency heads at will. He needed to have cause, meaning that there needed to be negligence or malfeasance or neglect of duty. Now he's going to be able to fire these people at more than a dozen agencies at a whim simply because they disagree with his own policy. If you remember back to when he actually fired Rebecca Slaughter, the email that fired her said that he was doing so because her priorities were different from the administration. So this is going to fundamentally reshape his power and continues to strengthen the executive branch and chip at the power of Congress. Now, on the other hand, the Lisa Cook decision wasn't totally a surprise. In fact, the justices actually signaled the way that they were approaching these 2 cases differently when they decided to take them off of the emergency docket, because they allowed the block on Lisa Cook's firing to remain in effect while this case continued. Now, this is a more preliminary ruling at this point, and they're kind of dodging the actual merits of the Fed, although they hint very heavily that they view the Fed differently from the other independent agencies. But they're blocking the Trump administration's bid to pause the lower court's ruling that had blocked her firing. So this will go back down to the lower court for further litigation, because this was in the early stages. But with the Supreme Court saying, you know, the Fed is different. And you mentioned that Kavanaugh was in the majority there. That's something that he had actually signaled during arguments. He made a point that, you know, what goes around comes around. And if we give the president this power right now to fire members of the Fed, that could come back to bite the president or the party in future presidencies.
Charles, you were live on the air as these decisions were coming down yesterday, less than 24 hours ago. Now, with some time to process and think through the significance of them, as we think about the ability of a president, any president now, to fire independent regulators, something that had been protected for almost a century, as Fallon said there. This allows those departments, those organizations, to become almost explicitly political with appointees from the president.
We've had so much conversation, Willie, about the notion of an authoritarian government or an authoritarian administration coming into play. But most of that has been rooted in the rhetoric that we've heard from Donald Trump. Yesterday, these Supreme Court decisions, particularly the 2 that we've been discussing with regards to the FTC and the Fed, they made that more of a reality. And I was very curious going into yesterday how they were going to toe the line between the 2 agencies and make a difference. And it seems to me that the impact that they understood, these justices knew that this could have with respect to Lisa Cook and the Federal Reserve, on the economy as a whole and the implications going forward likely played a role in how they decided that case. On the other hand, when you're talking about the amount of power that has now been given to the president and the executive branch to make these unilateral decisions about administrative agencies, that is a scary thing to think about because of the fact that these, Willie, are supposed to be independent organizations. These are supposed to be independent agencies that don't get into the type of politicized nature of what Donald Trump would like to see happen from his leadership.
So what is the distinction, as you see it, between this first decision and the second one with regards to the Federal Reserve? Why the carve-out, effectively, for the Fed?
They haven't really been as clear as I would like. And I think that Fallon talked a little bit about the fact that they kind of punted on that issue of addressing it squarely, which is not a surprise. The Supreme Court doesn't necessarily deal with more than they have to if they don't want to. And here they did not want to. But it was clear that they did see the Fed differently, and they made it very clear that they saw the Fed differently, even as they didn't go into the distinctions as to why.
Charles, were you surprised that one of the court decisions yesterday struck at the fable, one of Donald Trump's favorite fables, about mail-in ballots?
No. And the reason why is because, Mike, when you're looking at the oral arguments in this case, Chief Justice Roberts kind of tipped his hand. And one of the things that he did was he asked very plainly, isn't the Constitution still the Constitution? And what that suggested to me when I thought about that was the idea that he understands that in plain speak, this is something that the court still regards as ironclad as much as possible. I do think, however, for the president, if you're looking at this and taking a step back, it is a loss, but it's not the biggest loss because, as we know, he has continued to now put pressure on Congress regarding the SAVE Act and trying to get that passed, as well as on the Postmaster General. So he is trying as best he can to backdoor his way to the same sort of ruling, even though he could not get it through the high court.
That was a 5-4 decision that effectively the Supreme Court said you count a mail-in ballot as long as it's postmarked by Election Day. So, Fallon, one last busy and very hot day there outside the Supreme Court. What will you be watching for today as these decisions come down?
Yeah, Willie, you know what's funny about the last day of the Supreme Court is that it's the only day where we actually know which decisions we're going to get. So, of course, we've been speculating that birthright citizenship might come last. And in fact, that is going to be one of the decisions that we get today. That'll be the landmark case of this term, no doubt. And the court looks poised to uphold that, saying that if you are born on American soil, you are an American citizen. Of course, the president, day one in office, tried to overturn that, saying that if your parents were here illegally or temporarily, you can't do that. And they made these interesting arguments about birth tourism that the Solicitor General was pushing during arguments, and the court seemed really skeptical of that. But that is going to be the biggest case that we will be talking about for days to come. There are 3 other cases still on the docket for the justices to decide today. There's a pair of cases involving transgender athletes, female transgender athletes who want to play on girls and women's sports teams. And those cases involve a pair of state bans on that participation. And it looks like the court is poised to uphold those bans. Now, notably, that decision would likely not affect the entire country, just the 27 states that have laws like that on the book, blocking those transgender athletes from playing. And then the other case, of course, involves campaign finance. And this has the potential to fundamentally shift power away from super PACs and back to the political party organizations. And the big thing to note there is that this will have major impacts on the midterm elections for the Republican Party, especially. Of course, they're really, really skilled at fundraising. And so if this power moves away from super PACs and back to the RNC, the NRSC, the NRCC, that could have major implications for this year's midterms. But we're expecting decisions in all 4 of those cases at 10 a.m. here at the court.